Okay, thanks everybody for joining in today's webinar. I'm going to really talk about gut health and healthy feeding practices. We have a supplement line that can help support gut health. There are feeds that we should be feeding. We really have to remember about forage, but it's really the manner in which we feed these horses. We can actually help gut health and decrease stress by just how we're feeding them. And so I think it's, as a dealer, understanding basic good feeding practices, it will help your clients get the most value out of the products and the feeds that they're feeding, and the horses will do the best. So we'll talk about normal foraging behavior. What is normal for horses? Look at a little bit of research on what is normal for horses. And then look at this stress. We know that gastric ulcers and hindgut ulcers are a part of stress in horses, but we've also got this new thing people are talking about, leaky gut. So we'll touch on that a little bit. The benefits of forage, and then feeding management. And I know you're thinking, looking at this, that there's a lot of influence on forage and feeding management, and how does that really pertain to our supplements? As I mentioned, I truly believe that it's a big overall picture, and we need to make sure that all the parts are functioning correctly so that each part can work the best. So I know a lot of you have seen this before, but we'll start out with, what is a horse designed to do? He's designed to stand in a field and eat a wide variety of forages. Remember that. He's designed to eat a wide variety of forages, and he wants to eat a wide variety of forages. They live in herds. They eat off the ground. You can see there's grasses, probably some forbs, some different weeds that they're all nibbling on. They're going to nibble most of the day, 14, 15 hours out of the day, moving around, eating off the ground. But on the right-hand side, this is more typical of what we do with our horses. We're going to feed them higher cereal grain-based diets. They're going to eat out of buckets at chest height. It changes the overall acidity of the GI tract, which is not always a good thing. And then some horses do a lot of exercise and some don't. But this is very foreign, putting this bucket at chest height like this. So if we look at digestive function, fiber from pasture or hay is necessary for a healthy digestive system. This whole section here, the cecum, the colon, this makes up 65% of the horse's digestive system, and it is primarily designed to digest fiber. So you can see from this diagram that it's so absolutely critical to feed fiber, but then it comes down to how we're feeding that fiber. Pasture provides a slow, continuous intake of fiber. You know, they're continually being able to monitor their own intake. We mentioned the trickle feeders, because they're constantly having a small amount of food traveling through the digestive system. Provides exercise. You have a horse out in a field for 24 hours, they're going to walk up to close to 10 miles a day. Cut that in, over a half, maybe we're just putting them out during the day, and they'll only walk 2.5 to 3 miles. But you can see that it gives them exercise. So when we lock horses up, we're decreasing their exercise. And they also have this natural foraging behavior. I think we all would relate to this graph and say, in spring and fall, as the grass grows more rapidly and we have an influx of that nice cool season grass, that's when horses would eat more, take more time eating, because the grass is more palatable. But this is really what I want you to take notice of. Free-ranging horses, wild horses out in a field, they will show 10 to 15 distinct feeding bouts in a 24-hour period. Not fed once a day, not fed twice a day, not fed 3, not even 4 times a day. 10 to 15 times they will feed throughout a 24-hour period. So I think it's always really important to understand what the horse will do in their natural environment, and then have a look at what we're doing to them and how much we've taken them away from that natural environment, and see where we may be indirectly causing some of these issues. So dry matter intake. that is when you look at the forage that's being fed and you take all of the moisture out of it, and on a dry matter basis, which straw is pretty much 100% dry matter, if you give them ad lib access, let them eat as much as they want, they're going to eat about 1.5% of their body weight. So that 1,000-pound horse will eat about 15 pounds a day. Hay, about 19, 20 pounds of hay a day, 1.9% of body weight. And fresh grass, now this is 2.6% of body weight on a dry matter basis. So remember, grass can be up to 80% moisture. So they're actually consuming about 5% of their body weight in grass to get that amount of actual dry matter and not just water. We know that horses chew in that circular motion, that bottom jaw chews in that circular motion, and the bottom jaw has a much wider motion when they're eating hay compared to eating grain or pellets. So adding long stem hay will give you that more natural chewing wear pattern, which will help with dental wear. And that horse out in a field grazing all day will chew about 60,000 times a day, which really helps to keep this nice even wear surfaces. Okay. Let's start looking at if we interfere, what happens. Okay, we've got horses. HF stands for high forage. So these horses were eating, one part of the diet was a grain concentrate, and 4 parts of the diet they were eating a haylage. The low forage diet, they were eating 4 parts of the diet came from grain and only 1 part from hay. What I think is really interesting is, let's go to the right-hand side of the graph and look at the total amount of time eating anything, but the total amount of time eating. Both horses, both groups, either low forage or high forage, spent the same amount of time actually eating. This is interesting. This is showing you that it doesn't matter what's available to them, they want to spend a certain amount of time eating, and they will eat whatever they can find so that they spend that amount of time eating. Eating the total ration, so the hay and concentrate given to them. The low forage, well, it was much quicker time to eat the concentrate and the small amount of forage, so they had less time eating the ration that we provided them. The high forage horses, well, it took them a lot longer because forage takes a lot longer to chew forage. This is what I find very interesting here. That the horses on the low forage diet, in the time that they had left over, they ate bedding and feces. Eating bedding is going to cause impaction colic, and we really don't want to have our horses forcing our horses to eat feces in order to get that foraging behavior and get plenty of forage to eat. So, other kind of anecdotal things that the researchers pointed out, with the horses on the low forage diet, they walked a lot more in their stalls, they had crib biting behavior, and when they exercised them on a treadmill, they were more excited than the high fiber horses. It's interesting. People will say, my horse doesn't like first cutting hay, or he only likes alfalfa, or he really likes this or that. If you just stick a camera on a horse and you put multiple sources of forage in the stall, forages that you know are more palatable, that they will prefer, and some less palatable forages that you know that you think they might not prefer. So you put a big pile of alfalfa, you put some second cut, really leafy grass hay, and then you put some really stemmy first cut hay. Can everybody still hear me okay? Okay, can everybody hear me now? I'm not quite sure what happened. Everybody hear me now? Yep, perfect. Okay, yeah. So we'll keep going. Not sure where it cut out, but I was mentioning that if your horses if you provide them with forages that they want to eat and forages that they don't want to eat, if you monitor them, they will actually occasionally go to those less palatable forages because they're higher in that non-digestible fiber, and they will chew on that. So the goal here is we should be providing multiple sources of forage to our horse. Even though They may not like that first cutting strimmy hay. Give them some of it. That's why I say in the wintertime, it's great to have a round bale in the field. It's something for them to chew on, and then put your better quality hay in the stall. Okay, so multiple sources of forages is how natural horses would graze, because remember, they're designed to eat a wide variety of forages. Everything we do with horses stresses them out. Exercise them, we exercise them in the heat, we transport them, they get injuries and pains. All of this causes stress. We also psychologically stress horses. Separation and feeding management, the way we feed horses, can really stress them out. And that's really what I want to highlight today. Let's look at gastric and colonic ulcers, because we know they are a function of physical and psychological stress. Gastric ulcers, about 90% of performance horses, colonic horses, about 60%, and gastric and colonic ulcers, about 50% of our performance horses. What's causing it? Well, we stick them in stalls. We meal feed them 2, maybe 3, 4 times a day. Remember, in the natural environment, that horse is going to eat 10 to 15 times a day. We don't feed them enough roughage. We stress them with physical stressors, and we use non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like bute too chronically. You've seen this slide. I want to go over it again, though. This is when you have, we stuck a little pH meter that's going to measure the acidity in the horse's stomach. And for 24 hours, we gave them plenty of hay, let them eat, and we measured the acidity in the stomach. Anything above this yellow line is considered good, buffered. And so we see at the beginning, in the first 6 hours, I would say 90% of the time, the acid is above that 4. But what I suspect has happened with these horses is they were not adapted to free choice hay. So they got all this hay, they gorged on it, and then they were full. And then they waited around until they weren't full, and they picked at it again and waited and picked at it again. If horses are adjusted to free choice hay, this will be more continual. This one was even more interesting. So we take those horses and we don't give them any feed for 24 hours. After 1 hour, we have really low, very strong acid. And people say, well, what are these spikes here? That's when they drank water. That diluted the stomach acid. After 18 hours, bleeding lesions. After just 6 hours of no food in the stomach, we have reddening of the tissue. But this is not uncommon practices where we at 5 o'clock at night feed the horses. They're done by 7. Everything's out of the stomach within 30 minutes, and we're not coming back till 7 a.m. the next morning. That's 12 hours of feed deprivation. So you're sitting right around here, this amount of time of having that strong acid sitting in the stomach, and at 6 hours we've already got reddening of the tissue. So by about 12 hours you've got ulcers developed, absolutely. Hindgut ulcers, well, we're going to notice more dehydration, diarrhea, anorexia, intermittent colic-like symptoms, but we've also got good and bad bugs back here, so we can even develop fever, and here are some blood work tests that your veterinarian can do. What are we going to do in these horses? Well, pelleted or cubed forage, because that long stem hay can be a bit abrasive. Do that for about 3 to 4 weeks. Slowly include some fresh grass back. The yeast, which is in our DDA, it's in our it's in the rescue aid, it's in the cool gut. The yeast will help stabilize that hindgut acidity so that we keep it above that 4. And then omega-3s, the DHA, will decrease inflammation, because remember what we said back here, by 6 hours we've got reddening of the tissue. But I want to go a little bit further, and I actually want to break down that gut mucosal lining. You know, what we always talk about when we talk about cool gut and some of those ingredients that can help the intestinal lining, help these cells. So this is our intestine, and we take a little snapshot of that. And we get these, so here's our blood supply down here. This is inside the digestive system. So this is food particles. And these are the intestinal mucosal cells. And between these cells, we're supposed to have these things called tight junctions. And a healthy tight junction, like a gate, it's closed. And the only time it opens is when we have food particles going through that are digested and we want to go through. So a bit of amino acid, some glucose flowing through into the bloodstream to go off into the organ to be used. These things here, these are called villi. They're little fingers, and you can see what they're doing. They're increasing the surface area of the gut, so we have more absorption capacity. But what happens in these sick horses is these tight junctions become faulty, and we call them, then they leak. They're constantly open a little bit, and we've got undigested food particles and toxins, which are supposed to stay in the digestive system, leaking into the bloodstream. Leaky gut. What are you going to see in these horses that perhaps have leaky gut? Well, colonic ulcers, gastric ulcers, dull coat, poor hooves because they're not absorbing nutrients. I have never been a one to say that horses really get a lot of allergies. Sometimes it's kind of a false positive when we do these allergy tests. But horses with leaky gut show these transient allergic symptoms because we've got all these toxins flowing into the blood supply, causing inflammation. It improves if we put horses on our acid proton pump inhibitors, our omeprazole, our GastroGuard kind of product. But as soon as you take them off, it completely comes back. And not just a change in behavior that we would see with a gastric ulcer, but now my horse has got very erratic behavior and chronic diarrhea. Which horses are going to be more typical of seeing this? Well, when we ultrasound the gut, we can usually see increased thickening of the intestinal mucosa, which is inflammation. High performance horses, we're sticking them in stalls, we're stressing them out. Nervous horses, chronic colic, antibiotics and no follow-up with a probiotic. Chronic pain, so we've got the long-term non-steroidals, even some horses with metabolic syndrome, and then the ones with stress. I won't go through all this research here, but we know from horses that do endurance racing, from people that do these Ironman races, that exercise, heat, dehydration, they all increase gut permeability. What is gut permeability? This is gut permeability. It's impermeable when the tight junctions work and stuff isn't getting back and forth. But it's permeable when stuff is flowing back and forth that it shouldn't. So we know that all these things increase stress and increase that leaky gut issue. What I want to focus on more is the psychological factors, because a lot of the physical factors we can't take away. We're going to continue to exercise them. We ride a lot in the heat. We're going to trailer them to shows, etc. So separation, fear, and feeding management. There is documented equine research that shows the psychological stress increases the gut permeability. Absolute minimum amount of forage, 1% of body weight. Oh, sorry, these are in kilograms. That's 10 pounds of forage. 1.2% of body weight, that would be 12 pounds of forage. 15 to 25 is where I typically sit. That's 1.5 to 2.5% of body weight. We need to make sure that we're feeding at least that amount to our horses to maintain a healthy gut. Some of you have seen this before. So these ponies were fed 0.6% of their body weight, way below that minimum amount, 1.1% of their body weight, about 1.6, or as much as they would eat. The best quality hay is only 50% digestible. So these numbers here are right in line with that digestibility. When you fed the horses 0.6% of body weight, they were only able to digest 34% of it. My suspicion here and what the authors suggested was that, say you break your arm and you got it in a cast, and then you take the cast off, what's happened to the muscles? They've all atrophied. The digestive system is made up of smooth muscles, and if you're not working them, i.e. they're not constantly pushing food through the digestive system, they start to atrophy and die off. So that's what happens when you don't feed enough forage. Feeding position, we know putting it on the ground, can significantly increase their chewing time. 2 pounds of grain on the ground, 1,000 times, 2 pounds of hay on the ground, 2,000 times. But you put that grain at chest height and they'll chew about 350 to 500 times. So again, number one, we're decreasing dental wearing. Number two, we're decreasing saliva production. And number three, we're decreasing the time it takes them to eat that food. So all things leading to poor dental wear and gastric ulcers. What can we do to mimic grazing behavior? How can we slow our horses down? Well, you can add chopped forage, but you have to add a lot of it. So if you're adding some dengue or something, you have to be adding at least 20% of the horse's diet. So if you're only feeding, let's say you're feeding 20 pounds of hay, then you've got to feed a considerable amount. You can replace a considerable amount of that with chopped forage. So if you add between 20 and 30% chopped forage, you can really increase the feeding time. Adding a lot of oil, so that 2 cups of oil that we talk about for weight gain, that will also increase the time it takes for them to eat their food. This study looked at the amount of times a day that you fed horses and correlated that to the oral stereotypies. And we associate oral stereotypies like chewing or crib biting with stress in horses. When you only fed them 2 meals a day, they had a lot of stereotypic behaviors, chewed a lot, stressed a lot. When you fed them 4 to 6 meals a day, they had way less of these poor behaviors, so less stress. This, I think, is really, really interesting. So this was 100 mares. They were Arabian mares housed at a reproductive facility in the Middle East. And they split them into 2 groups of 50 mares. 50 mares is a lot of mares. And in one group, they fed them 10 pounds of hay. They put them out during the day in this little run. So the 50 mares are all out there together. And they fed them 10 pounds of hay in hay nets. All those 50 hay nets all around the paddock, and they had 10 pounds of hay in there. And then back in the stall at night, they ate 7 pounds of grain and another 10 pounds of hay in the stalls at night. Okay, that's one group, continually eating throughout the day. The other group, they go out in the little paddock during the day, but they're not allowed to eat anything. They have to eat all of their hay, the 20 pounds of hay and the 7 pounds of grain. They have to eat that all at night in the stall. Then they measured what they call agnostic behavior. That is biting each other, aggression towards each other. The mares that were not allowed to eat outside, they just had to be out there milling around together, they bit each other more. They were nastier to each other. Okay, compared to the horses that were allowed to eat as much as they want. They were eating throughout the day and throughout the night. They were much nicer to each other. They didn't have the amount of agnostic or nasty behaviors. So we associate that with less stress. They went a little further, which I think is really neat, and they associated this with an actual measure of success: reproduction, overall fertility. And we noted that the mares that were allowed to eat continually out in the field and then back in at night, they had 81% overall fertility compared to the horses that were not allowed to eat during the day and they were stressed and they were biting each other. They only had 50% overall fertility. That is quite significant if you want to make your money breeding horses. We know that stress in any form, physical or psychological, will interfere with those GnRH and LH pulse frequencies. People in the repro world know that we need these to develop follicles. So I thought that was really neat. You can decrease stress in the horses and you can increase overall fertility. Rate of intake. Oh, we have our horses that are eating the feed really quickly, so what are we going to do to slow them down? If you just put it in a bucket and put it on the ground, it doesn't really slow them down. These researchers threw some balls in that feed tub. Well, they just kicked the balls out, so that didn't slow them down. When you fed them in a tub like this, see, it's got these holes in the bottom of it. They called it a waffle-like pattern. That really considerably slowed them down. But if you took these horses with the regular feed tub on the ground and you put some water in it, that actually sped them up. So I know I tell you a lot, wet the feed, that'll slow them down. Actually, it will speed it up. Hay net size, because I know a lot of us use different types of hay nets. So this group, their control group, they just fed the hay on the ground in the corner of the stall. They had a large hay net, a medium hay net, and a small hay net. You can see them, large, big, wide holes, medium, and small. And they gave them 6 hours to eat the hay. And in that 6 hours, they're actually, the horses on the medium and small hay nets, they didn't consume all of the food. So they gave those 2 groups as much time as they wanted to consume their hay. You can see the control group, they ate it really quickly. They ate it at about 3 pounds per hour. The control group and the large hay net, they were the same. But the medium and the small hay net, it took significantly less time. It took 6.5 hours for the horses to eat the same amount of forage out of the small hay net, and it only took 3 hours to eat it off the ground. So you can considerably decrease hay intake time. They went a little further, and now let's look at stress and those behaviors. When we put it on the floor, feed it in a hay bag where it's harder for them to pull it out, or versus a slow feeder on the ground. So the horses, when they were fed out of the hay bag, they had this is measures of stress. So they showed way more frustration that compared to on the ground where they're just picking away at it, or in the slow feeder. But when they ate it on the ground, as you noted before, they ate it really quickly compared to slow feeders or small hay nets. Let's look at forage type. We know that alfalfa really helps with the gut buffering. We want to feed small meals frequently. It helps with saliva production. It serves as a mat that sits on that hay. So we've looked at what horses normally do and how they compensate for the behaviors that we put them through. And we've looked at different manners of feeding that hay. So we're feeding plenty of hay, but I think the slow feeder in the corner works out to be the best. If you don't have that, feeding out of a small hay net is ideal, but just throwing it in the corner, they'll eat it quickly, but they'll have less stereotypic behaviors than some of those hay bag type feeder systems. The goal is always to decrease stress. So number one, we're going to decrease stress. But as we've said, there's certain stresses we can't decrease. So what are we going to use in the diet to overcome that physical stress or the stress of riding in the heat? So in our supplements, we've got yeast. Yeast in its live form, like a live cell yeast, is considered a probiotic. When we're adding bacteria to the diet that's live, we call that a probiotic. Anything that's dead, like a yeast extract, which is the outer wall of the yeast, that would be a prebiotic. It's dead. Your moss and FOS, which are in the cool gut, these are considered prebiotics. They feed those good bacteria and they bind up bad bacteria. We've got integral in the DDA, or the digestive feed additive, and that is going to bind mold spores, bad mycotoxins from mold spores. That's a prebiotic. It's not live, it's part of the yeast, it's a prebiotic. And then in the cool gut, we've got these other ingredients, the L-glutamine, the glycine, the whey protein concentrate. When I say they help those mucosal tissue, they help keep those tight junctions tight so that we're not leaking toxic materials back and forth. So, in summary, horses are designed to eat forage regardless of what you do with them, whether they're the highest performing barrel racing horses, quarter horses, whether they're racing thoroughbreds, or whether they're just our pasture ornament and we live in the high desert and we really don't have any grass available. They still need to eat a certain amount of forage. Now, some horses don't have any teeth, so they can't eat long stem forage. They still need to eat 1.2, 1.5% of their body weight in fiber, so you're looking at feeding 12 to 15 pounds of a fiber pellet. You want to mimic grazing behavior however you can, and doing all of this will decrease that psychological stress. Now, there was one other study that I didn't put up, but they looked at slow feeders, and they actually never replenished the hay while the horse was in the stall. When the horse went out to be tacked up, to be groomed, to be washed, whatever, that's when they put the hay in the stall. Because you all know that there is a lot of anxiety associated with the anticipation of feeding. So being able to feed the horses either when they've still got feed available or when they're not in the stall, that can really decrease stress, that anticipation of feeding behavior. We've also got multiple forage sources. In the wintertime, it's really easy to do that. Put a round bale out there that it's more local grass hay, and then feed your better quality, Timothy or alfalfa in the stall. So with that, questions. Type them in, unmute yourself and write them and talk. But we've got one question. Can increase in acid production be inherited? Is it genetic? No, I don't think so. But here's one thing. There's been a lot of research in pigs, because in a normal natural environment, pigs don't wean until much later on. In a commercial pig operation, we're weaning those pigs very early. And we know that increases stress and it increases gut permeability. Some researchers have also said that that increase in gut permeability stays with them through adulthood. So I suspect that just like with developmental orthopedic disease or other issues, that if we stress those babies and we cause this leaky gut issue, that might cause permanent damage that we could take through into adulthood. So some of those horses that have chronic colic, they just seem to colic when they turn around. Those horses may have had some stress when they were babies that's kind of predisposed them to that lifelong issues. Redmond Rock is promoting bentonite clay as an ulcerative preventative. How could this possibly work? Well, bentonite clay has some calcium, has some magnesium in it because it's dirt. So it'll give you some buffering that way. It'll give you very transient protection to the gut lining, but it's certainly got nothing in it that will help with those tissues, nothing in it that will help with that those permeable gut cells. So it's transient, and there's nothing in Redmond Rock that is any better than the DAC supplements. DAC supplements have way more benefits. If a horse has an ulcer and you are not aware of it, will our supplements cure it? Well, I would love to say that our supplements will cure world hunger and cancer and HIV, but that's why I talked about this whole presentation was about all of the other management factors that you need to take into account. If you're chronically stressing your horses with psychological stress because of how you feed them, then sure, the cool gut will give you some benefit, but not as much benefit as it could. So depending on the severity of the ulcer, I can't say whether it would fix it or not, because it's really big picture. There's so many parts to this pie that we need to take into account so that our supplements can have the best chance of working. I've got a text question here. I will read out. A horse with an autoimmune disorder is on steroids, so everything stops growing. Fungus stops growing. What DAC product would be the best? Okay, with an autoimmune disorder, the immune system is suppressed. And so I would say you want to improve immune function, so you want to have them on DDA every day because that's just going to help with overall gut health. Make sure they're on a good vitamin and mineral supplement, so the Total Performance or the Dark Orange. You've probably got some inflammation, so the Yucca or the DHA Perform will help with inflammation. Any other questions? How do you manage grazing forage when the horse is overweight? Great question. So you don't turn them out in a field, or you turn them out with a grazing muzzle on early in the morning, depending on their body weight. But this is where it really becomes intense management. I still want you to mimic grazing behavior. I still want them to have at least 1.2% of body weight. So you need to find 12 pounds of that less palatable, less digestible hay, that stemmier hay that you're going to supply to them, and you're going to give them a very minimum amount of the vitamin. You're going to give them a vitamin mineral supplement because it doesn't have any extra calories. Do you feel DAC will ever offer these colic programs? No, I don't. I don't believe that they're cost effective, and I believe that we have more faith in our products that are, we do education. We teach people about the whole picture And when you have the whole picture in place, you're feeding the horses correctly and you're using these products, we just don't believe that colic is a high risk. If it's a high risk, then you're not taking into account, you're not educating horses on all of these other, educating horse owners on all the other factors that decrease colic. In this area, a lot of people are switching to EquiLick, so you're able to analyze that product for me and sound more educated on their product when I'm trying to keep my customers. So the one thing I will tell you about any lick product, and I'll preface this with, we are in the process of developing a lick tub for horses that will be a DAC product. It will be, the basis will be DAC orange, but this is something that you use as a last resort. You've got horses out on the range that you don't see every day and you want to give them a bit of something is better than nothing. Then a lick tub is you know, better than nothing there. But if you've got horses in a herd, they're really, these lick tubs are driven by salt intake. And one horse is the dominant horse and they lick the tub the most, and then you've got one horse that is submissive and it gets one lick a week. So if you've got high performance animals, you need to be really monitoring what you're feeding them, and I don't think even the best lick tub that we're going to make is ideal. They're designed for horses out on the range. Now, I haven't looked deeply into the EquiLick products to tell you if they've got chelated minerals or probiotics, prebiotics, any of that, but I can certainly look at that. I stall my horses just for them to eat their feed in peace and then turn them out. Isn't this a healthy way? Sure, that's fine. As long as your horses aren't stressed when you put them in the stall. You can tell some horses just don't want to be without their buddies. If you feel like it's more peaceful for them and less stressful for them, then that's ideal. But utilize those ways of feeding them closer to the ground, chopping up forage and putting it in there, you know, mimicking slowing down rate of intake. If you're feeding them hay in the stall, put it in a slow feeder or a small hay net closer to the ground. What about putting them in stalls because that is where they are using them? I don't really understand that question, so you might need to elaborate. I'm going to cough. Any other questions? No other questions? Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining our webinar today. For those that are viewing this after the fact, if you have other questions, please go to the DAC website, and on there you will find an Ask the Nutritionist, and you can email in your questions.